I remember how I felt when I became old enough to vote. Nervous, anxious, energetic. I stood in line at the polls at my university. It was, at least for me, an exciting moment. I was finally able to fulfill my civic duty. That election, and others since, occurred without incident. I get in line, I vote, and I leave. And then 2020 happened.
The U.S. Postal Service will handle millions of mail-in ballots during the 2020 U.S. election.
As many Americans did, I chose to mail in my ballot early to keep myself and my family safe from COVID-19. But when I submitted, my local election board contested my ballot. There had been a dispute about my address, and when I called in for an explanation, I was informed I may be under investigation, pending possible election fraud. Under the anxiety and stress of perhaps accidentally committing a federal crime, I waited for nearly a month, checking the ballot status, my emails, and mailbox daily. And eventually, the stress became so overwhelming that I just drove to my local election board. And there, I was told, there was no dispute. There was no investigation. My ballot was already accepted and just needed additional processing because I had recently changed addresses. And I was told, even if I had made a mistake, because I live in California, I would have been given a chance to rectify the error. Obviously, I was relieved. I wouldn't be going to jail. But my experience reminded me of Americans who live in parts of the United States who aren't as forgiving. Like the case of Lenisa Bratcher in North Carolina, who, because she voted while on probation and didn't know that made her ineligible under North Carolina law, now faces 2 felony charges and up to 19 months in prison. Or the case of Crystal Mason from Texas, another black woman who voted while on probation, who is now facing 5 years in prison. Looking into the origin of such harsh policies, these felony disenfranchisement laws date back to the 19th century and were created as some of the first instruments of black voter suppression after the events of the Civil War. But my research led me further than just racist legislature. I discovered the story of a man named Mose Norman, a black man in 1920 who had the audacity to try to get himself and other black citizens registered to vote, inciting the anger and fury of the Klu Klux Klan. This is the Ocoee Massacre of 1920. Welcome to Do You Know, a podcast project produced with our small majority and hosted by me, Corey Cow Wynn. Do You Know narratively retells the forgotten, ignored, and hidden stories of anti-blackness, women, and people of color in the racial history of America. This story contains portrayals of violence and racial discrimination, which may be distressing for some listeners. November 1920. Approximately 13 miles outside of Orlando, in Orange County, Florida, sits the small farming town of Ocoee. In the night, lights flicker and burn at the local church. Inside, the pews are lined with black men and women, eagerly taking notes. They're listening intently to a pair of white men standing at the front, giving a lecture to the audience in attendance. But this isn't a nighttime sermon or prayer. The 2 men are giving instructions on how to register to vote, how to pay poll taxes, and how to fill out a ballot. In the clandestine shadow of the dark, this cosmopolitan group meets weekly in secret. They're trying to change Florida, one group of voters at a time. After the Civil War, like much of the South, Florida became a bastion of white supremacy, as Confederates were eventually re-enfranchised as U.S. citizens and exercised their prejudices at the ballot box, electing Southern Democrats, who are today's Republicans, who would pass racially discriminatory legislation, suppressing black voters. In fact, Ocoee itself was settled by a former Confederate captain named Bluford Sims. These laws led to decades of essentially one-party rule in the South, with that party being white supremacy. Black citizens in the South found themselves either disenfranchised from voting or intimidated by the very real threats to their lives by white supremacists and the Klu Klux Klan. But in the wake of Black Americans returning home from World War I, there became a surge of patriotism and duty among Black Americans. They had fought for their country, and now they wanted to fight for themselves to live equally in their country. This national wave of civic duty, especially within Florida, generated local voter registration movements led by Black women like Eartha M.M. White, a prominent business owner who held voter registration workshops for Black GIs returning from the war. Hoping to capitalize off this momentum, the Republican Party, who would become today's Democrats, launched a statewide voter registration campaign led by Judge Cheney White and lawyer W.R. O'Neill, hoping to help enfranchise the Black community as a way of ending the one-party rule of the Southern Democrats and white supremacy in Florida. And this too was occurring in Ocoee. With nearly half of its population being Black, Ocoee was also home to prominent wealthy Black entrepreneurs and landowners. Two of the most important to the community were Mose Norman, a widely successful farmer, and July Perry, a labor broker. Working together with Cheney and O'Neill, Perry and White used their wealth to pay off poll taxes for Black citizens in Orange County who couldn't afford them. And they ran the secret weekly night workshops at the local church to teach Black citizens about the ins and outs of voting. But why did they have to hold their workshops in secret, in a church, in the middle of the night? Well, it's because of these guys. The Klu Klux Klan. The infamous white supremacy group where cowardly white men wear cloth cones on their heads. But despite their ridiculous appearance, their rage and terroristic violence against people of color wasn't a joke. Their numbers dwindled in the 1910s, but the Klan saw a resurgence going into the mid-1900s, especially after the Red Summer of 1919. The Klan, bolstered by returning white servicemen from World War I, erupted into violent riots in a dozen cities across America, harming and killing Black people. They hoped to suppress the Black veterans returning home and deny them any idea of equality that serving in the war could have created. And, in response to the national and statewide push for Black voter registration in Florida, the KKK responded. The Grand Master of the Florida chapter of the KKK sent a letter to Judge Cheney and W.R. O'Neill and listed out quite clearly what would happen if they continued to aid Black citizens.
I was informed that you were of the habit of going among the Negroes of Orlando and delivering lectures, explaining to them just how to become citizens and how to assert their rights. If you are familiar with days of Reconstruction that followed in the wake of the Civil War, you will recall that the scalawags of the North and the Republicans of the South proceeded very much the same as you are proceeding, to instill the Negro the idea of social equality. If you are a scholar, you know that history repeats itself, and that he who resorts to your kind of a game is handling edged tools. We shall always enjoy white supremacy in this country, and he who interferes must pay the consequences.
Not mincing words, the Klan proved true on their promise. In response to the Black voter registration across Florida, days before the election, the Klan marched in the streets of Orlando, Daytona, and Jacksonville in full regalia. One night, Klan members even broke into a political meeting full of Black people and promised that no Black citizens would be allowed to vote. With patriotic Black Americans coming out in unprecedented numbers to vote, and the racist KKK entrenching themselves to prevent them, a showdown was imminent. Due to the chaos and a lack of objective historical bookkeeping, there's over 127 different accounts of what happened on November 2nd, 1920 in Ocoee. And so I've tried my best to provide the most simple, verifiable timeline. It's election day in Ocoee. Mose Norman and a group of his fellow citizens and activists make their way to their polling location. But when trying to cast their ballot, the white poll workers told Norman he had not paid his poll tax, despite Norman being the community leader who paid poll taxes for black citizens who couldn't afford it. Other black people were told they hadn't paid their poll tax, or that their address had just suddenly gone missing from the registration. Norman and the group tried to argue, but the poll workers simply said they'd have to speak to the public notary to sort out the paperwork. But conveniently, the notary had gone on an all-day fishing trip, meaning he just happened to be unavailable for election day. Enraged, Norman rode to Judge Cheney's house, and Cheney told him it was his constitutional right to vote, and told Norman to go back, and if anyone denied him, to write down their names for a future lawsuit or investigation. Norman headed back in the afternoon, and an altercation occurred. Few accounts can be verified about what exactly happened, but Norman left soon after. Upset after the altercation in Norman's attempt to, well, just vote, an angry white mob formed. Seeking him out, the group heard that he had gone into hiding at July Perry's house. An Ocoee police chief, Clyde Perry, deputized the white mob and led them to July Perry's home. The mob surrounded the house and began to interrogate the Perry family, demanding Norman be brought outside. When the Perry family refused to comply, the mob began to fire into the home. July Perry with his family fled into the forest. They ran through the trees and bushes trying to flee. Unfortunately, they were caught by the mob, who imprisoned them. But it wasn't just the Perry family who were driven out from their homes. The mob moved on and set fire to Perry's home in their all-black neighborhood. Other black families began to flee from Ocoee as the smoke and fire rose over the small town. Norman, sensing the danger to his life, had escaped earlier in the day, evading capture. And so the mob took out their fury on Perry, who wasn't even the man they were looking for. Clyde's men, among them Sam Salisbury, a known KKK member, dragged July Perry by horse to the home of Judge Cheney. There, Perry was lynched by the white mob in front of Cheney's home. To add robbery to murder, Perry's wife, still held in jail, was forced to sign over their land to Bluford Sims, the Confederate captain and July's former employer. With Perry's murder as the catalyst, over the years, many other black families suffered the same fate. Their lives threatened and land signed over to white developers. Or they chose to sell as they realized how unsafe they were in Ocoee, moving away to other parts of Florida. Census data shows us that in 1920, around 255 black people, 18 of which owned land, lived in Ocoee. By 1930, only 2 black people who worked as domestic help remained. With the help of Clyde Perry, the police sheriff who deputized the white mob, Ocoee had become a sundown town, a term for an area known to black people as unsafe for fear of racial retribution. Parents would tell their children not to be in Ocoee after dark. And it continued to be unsafe for black people for the next 40 years. And even when the black citizens began to return in the 1970s, many testified to having slurs hurled at them, bottles being thrown, and an overall sense of being unwanted and unwelcome. But eventually, as the black community re-solidified across the decade, a movement to acknowledge and rectify the Election Day Massacre grew. In 1989, the West Orange Reconciliation Task Force was created for that exact purpose. But instead of uniting the community in recognition and healing as they hoped, instead, white people in Ocoee rebelled against any notion of acknowledgement. They argued, quote, to let sleeping dogs lie, and constantly questioned why the commission wanted to discuss the events of 1920. But despite white resistance, the commission and other activist groups pushed on. Because of the continued fight for justice, in 2003, Ocoee approved the creation of the Human Relations Diversity Board, a body composed of activists, experts, and volunteers to advise on matters of racial equality and diversity. And then, 2018 saw the election of George Oliver III, Ocoee's first ever black commissioner. He was followed by another black commissioner in 2019 named Larry Brinson. Now, 2 out of the 3 commissioners presiding over Ocoee are black. And Governor Ron DeSantis recently signed a bill requiring schools to teach the Ocoee Massacre as part of Florida history. Through the work of Oliver, Brinson, the HRDB, and the task force, finally, in November 2020, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, the city signed a letter of apology and officially recognized the massacre of 1920. They held a live-streamed 5-day event to commemorate and acknowledge the pain of those who had lost everything or were forced to sell their hard-earned land for pennies on the dollar. But as some things change, others stay the same. Despite these acknowledgments, just as in other attempts to enact economic racial justice, in 2019, Florida denied the attempt to reward black descendants reparations for having their land stolen or forcibly sold. A land deed research project conducted by Pamela Schwartz, who runs the Orange County Regional History Center, found that the total estimated value of the land taken from black citizens would be worth around $9 million today. And still, when State Senator Randolph Bracy introduced Bill SB 8, which would award monetary reparations to descendants whose family members were affected by the Election Day massacre, it died in the Florida Senate back in March of 2020. Not that I'm surprised. It took 100 years to get an apology. How many more years for reparations? If you've been listening along to this premiere season of Do You Know, you may see the pattern. Every story we've chosen is an incident centered on the destruction of black communities, to white violence and racist fury. And there's a reason for that. Do You Know was not created in a vacuum. The show's origins are rooted firmly in the wave of social justice activism, birthed from the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, caused by the systemic racism inherent to police institutions in America. The loss of these individual, unique black lives is a tragedy, and we wanted to show how they've been preceded by the devastation of entire black communities like Tulsa, Ocoee, and Wilmington. These events shaped the history of these black people in America. Imagine the thousands of families, still barely half a generation off the Civil War, that's 50 years, forced to restart with nothing after being put out by white terrorists. Anything they did was met with white anger, fury, and violence. In Wilmington, black people weren't allowed to hold office. In Tulsa, they couldn't be wealthy. In Ocoee, they couldn't vote. And now today, Eric Gardner can't breathe. Philando Castile can't have a broken taillight. Ahmaud Arbery can't go on a run. Breonna Taylor can't sleep. The names go on and on and on and on. We only know these names because of social media and the use of smartphone recording. Imagine all the black lives lost before camera phones or Facebook, whose voices would have gone unanswered without proof of their oppression. Or worse yet, think about all the holes in our history. How many other Tulsas, Wilmingtons, or Ocoees were there? I chose these events for their relative obscurity, but I'm sure there are more I missed, or ones who were never recorded, lost to time forever. I hope this season was able to demonstrate that the legacy of this anti-black violence is rooted in American history. It's integral to our story as a nation. And it's remarkable to me that these events are not commonplace in historical U.S. curriculum. To ignore these moments fails to demonstrate the destruction of white racism and how the U.S. government repeatedly failed its black citizens to protect them from it, and sometimes even actively participated in the demolishing of black communities. I also want to critique myself. In choosing these events, I acknowledge that I, a person who is not Black, am sharing stories that center on Black pain. And though done in the name of education, this was most likely not my place. Moving forward, anti-Blackness will continue to be a part of Do You Know's educational storytelling. But future seasons won't be so bleak, and nor will Black pain be so prominent. This podcast was created in the midst of the Trump presidency, when my hope was honestly in short supply. And I found myself surrounded by people ignorant to the racism endemic to U.S. history. And no matter who is in charge, I'm always going to point at the ugly things I find. I can't ignore them. I won't. But that doesn't mean I can't highlight the good. To find the missing inspirational stories of Black people, minorities, LGBTQ+, and the women who shine with the radiance of their passion and dedication to advancing social justice. And so with that, thank you for listening to the first season of Do You Know? While this may be the end of our season, Our Small Majority and Little White Lies will continue to air weekly, so please do check them out wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a question or comment, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, or better yet, you can call in to leave a voice message with the link in the episode's description. A special thank you to my editor and savior, Eliza Diacampo, our amazing marketing guru, Megan Sullivan, the incredible composer, Jamie Pangan, and to the founders of Our Small Majority, Matthew Goriachkovsky and Christian Black. This has been Corey Cow Wynn. Thank you for listening.